because this notion of executive functioning problems is acknowledged as an issue for many neurodivergent people, autistic people, and people with ADHD in particular. Is pretty much part of the definition of ADHD. It's a bit subtler where it fits in for autistic people. Two of the questions then may be, well, how does it actually fit in? So how does it present, say, in our experiences as therapists or as autistic people or autistic and ADHD people? And then the other question is, and how do we respond to that?
And it does make you wonder whether routines have been adapted or adopted by autistic people, not because they're rigid and inflexible, but actually because it's actually very helpful, because you don't have to constantly think about where to put your wallet and then where to find it the next day. If you have a routine, you just don't have to think about that anymore.
Well, we're talking today about this notion of executive functioning and executive dysfunctioning, kind of pretty well-known terms for anyone who works with autistic people or people with ADHD, and pretty well-known terms. I think for a lot of people who simply are autistic or have ADHD, it's one of those shifts, isn't it, that the psychological language has become much better known to people themselves rather than just to professionals. It's one of the wonders of the internet, I suppose. So executive functioning has become a fairly well-known term, and executive dysfunction. And it seems to be an important one. We're following on from talking about self-regulation and emotional self-regulation and things like that in the last couple of sessions. We want to say a bit more about this specific area and chat a bit about this idea of executive functioning and executive dysfunction. But I also think it's an interesting idea just to interrogate a little bit rather than just run with, because where did this idea come from, and who decides what's good executive functioning and who decides what's executive dysfunction, I think is the kind of question we also need to have in front of us these days, and not just grab this kind of terminology wholesale. It's a well-established term in psychology. It's not something that just came into being in relation to working with the area of neurodivergence. So if we take it as a psychological concept, the first thing about it, if I can go on for a minute, about this,
go for it.
The first thing about it that I came across, a few years back in a bit of my reading, was that actually it's a relatively vague term. It covers a multitude of things, which don't necessarily have to all fit together. It's just a bit of a catch-all term, which is fine. That doesn't mean it isn't useful, but it doesn't have a one simple meaning. It covers things like, and this is from a general list, psychological list. It's, not specifically autism or ADHD related, but the concept of executive functioning is supposed to cover things like the ability to inhibit impulses when necessary, the ability to shift from one thing to another when necessary, the ability to sufficiently modulate and control your emotional responses as necessary, the ability to initiate tasks when necessary, sufficient working memory to, carry out a task, the ability to plan and organize over the longer term, including organizing things like materials and so on, and the ability to monitor your performance with regard to a goal, so you have a sense of whether you're getting what you want or not. And that's a multitude of things, all of which are fascinating and very important in people's lives, but it just shows how much is packed into a term like executive functioning. And it also, to me, raises the question, who decides whether somebody is dysfunctional around those things or not? Who decides whether somebody is sufficiently flexible about shifting from one task to another? On what basis? Is it compared to some neuronormative standard, which is what would concern me, or is it if it bothers the person themselves and they feel, well, I'd like to be able to be more flexible or have better working memory or whatever. So I do think it's an important concept, and we I think do make use of it to some extent in therapy, but it's one I think that does need that bit of unpacking in order to be useful.
That's a really good place to start, actually, Eoin. I'm really glad to hear that, because when we were doing the course, the Dr. Luke Bearden one with Sheffield Hallam, one of the things that we had to study was executive functioning. And so with it being a regular university, you had to actually provide a working definition of executive functioning, you know, from which you were operating. I haven't brought that actual definition word for word with me, but I can remember it. And it's something about an umbrella, a set of processes and that are under one umbrella of the word executive functioning that are called into use when a person is seeking to achieve a desired, anticipated goal. So it's like when you think about going to pick up the kids from school, for example, you might have to think about making sure you've got a coat on, locking the window, grabbing your list because you're going to nip to the supermarket on the way back, and making sure you've got your keys and you don't lock yourself out of the house and you can get in the car, then thinking about where you're going to go and how you're going to drive there, you know, and all of those kinds of things. And have you got enough petrol in the car? These are all the kinds of things. It's like sequencing, prioritizing, planning, organizing your thoughts and equipment or things that you may or may not need to be able to just do that one small thing, which is to drive and pick up the kids and bring them back.
And I suppose it's interesting that, you know, probably it is an automatic kind of phrase to say that one small thing, but is it small? Then this is the question, isn't it? Isn't that the whole question, you know, because this notion of executive functioning problems is acknowledged as an issue for many neurodivergent people, autistic people, people with ADHD in particular. ADHD in particular, it's some form of executive functioning problems is pretty much part of the definition of ADHD. It's a bit subtler where it fits in for autistic people, and yet similarly, it's accepted. You know, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't interrogate it or check it out and make sure it's true, but it's generally seen to be common amongst autistic people as well, is that they have some of executive functioning problems, carrying out exactly the kind of task you just outlined there. You know, it gets overwhelming, or there's difficulties in managing the time, or in you know, operating according to the time, difficulties in, you know, kind of maybe shifting from a task that you're already doing to shift over to that task and leaving on time, collect kids from school, all those things. But I suppose maybe the two of the questions then maybe, well, how does it actually fit in? So how does it present, say, in our experience as therapists or as autistic people or autistic and ADHD people? How does that actually present? What are the common ways that we run up against executive dysfunction problems? And then the other question is, and how do we respond to that? Like, is it always a response of, well, then there's something in you that needs fixing, so to speak, something that needs to be improved, or sometimes is it, well, that's simply not your strength and everything doesn't have to be, or perhaps there are, you know, ways in which the environment around you can adjust, and so that the expectations are different, or that somebody else can take on some of the tasks that aren't your strength, or that you can make decisions that doesn't, you know, mean you have less to do less of the things that don't come naturally to you. Is it, I think sometimes the assumption in the older models of working with autism and ADHD, the typical kind of pathology models, do tend to see executive functioning as a problem in the person that needs fixing. And that's the bit, I suppose, that we want to be careful about here.
Absolutely, yes, because I had a quick flick over of the old psychology kind of way of describing it, and a few of the descriptions all seem to boil down to saying that executive functioning, or dysfunction, if you like, exists in the person, you know, in 4 domains: that of cognitive, behavior, motor, and sensory functioning. But I'd like to go back to what you were saying a moment ago in terms of, well, who decides? And if we use that kind of reasoning or explanation of what executive functioning is or is for, what that I was referring to a moment ago, it's an anticipated goal. These are things to reach an anticipated goal. Well, who's anticipating and whose goal is it?
Whose goal? Yeah, big question.
Yeah. So if we're thinking about rather than saying there's cognitive inflexibility or there's not enough control of inhibitory control or task initiation, why would a person be wanting to set themselves up like that? In my experience of working with clients, people have found ways to make their life work for them. So if they've got to pick the kids up, they've got systems already. They might not even know that they've got systems that they use and processes, but it's not like they ever live and they never remember to pick up the kids or can't manage to do it.
No, but I suppose this is where, maybe expectations and mainstream neuronormative, possibly modern capitalist even expectations come into the picture, because in some ways a lot of the executive functioning difficulties that people actually run up against, or even that would occur to us as examples like the one did for you around picking the kids up from school, they are they're to do with the way the modern world works, an awful lot of them. They're complex tasks that, not all human beings in history necessarily had to deal with. The traffic on the way to picking kids up from school, that's a very complex task and a stressful one. And many people who outwardly are, so-called, super moms or whatever, and who every day pick their kids up on time from school, possibly suffer great stress in doing so, whether they're autistic or have ADHD or not. That's the sort of piece underneath that nobody wants to look at sometimes. But, for me in particular, because there's been such a focus from the field of psychology, in the past on children and executive function, and particularly on autistic children and executive function, and ADHD children and executive function problems. School is the piece of the picture that I think really needs to be talked about a bit, because in the end of it all, number one, in schools, it isn't the children's goals largely that are at issue. Most children don't want to do the things they're asked to do in school. Some of them they want to do, but a lot of them they don't. They don't want to sit still for that length of time. They don't necessarily want to do all the subjects they're doing. They don't want to spend all day in school, 5 days a week. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some benefits to that. I'm not saying that we should completely abolish schools, but we're not talking about children's goals there. And secondly, they're kind of, again, I'm not saying they're not useful in some ways, the school system, but the goals of schools are, again, goals and structures and systems and expectations that would look quite strange to most of humans in most of human history. They are, again, relatively recent idea. And again, I'm not saying that makes them a bad thing as such, but a lot of, I think, concerns around executive functioning, that's where they come from. They come from, well, this child can't sit still all day. This child can't change suddenly from one subject to another when the bell rings. This child can't, hold sufficient in their working memory to regurgitate it at the appropriate time, But those are all those are useful functions, but the expectation that every child can do them according to the education system is really, it's questionable, I think, when you think about it.
Yeah, because as well as the things that the goals that may not be chosen by the individual person or child, there's the ways that the person is expected to do them might not be the ways that suit that individual child or that individual person. For example, autistic people excel in logical reasoning as long as there's consistency in the conditions, and then they really excel in logical reasoning, and they, meaning people like you and I, can have a sustained interest and focus on detail, much more than people who are not autistic. and we can do behavior by rote very comfortably and very effectively and accurately as well. These are our strengths, and we've got a good visual spatial memory. These are functioning. These are executive functioning things, that we are very good at, but then what we are very sensitive to. So the thing about the domains that I was talking about earlier, about the motor, the sensory, behavior, and cognitive, interestingly, if there's chaos, then the logical reasoning is affected. The executive functioning in that regard gets affected by chaos. So then when you are at the checkout and you're putting on your things onto the conveyor belt thingy, and everything is consistent, so people are moving around, there's a consistent amount of movement, sound and light, and everything is where it should be, then the executive functioning doesn't get disturbed. But if the fire alarm starts going off, or something, or the manager comes over and interferes with this, that, or the other, it's quite normal to think, oh, what am I doing? I'm not loading on the things in an automatic process anymore. I've got to override it in some kind of way because my flow has been broken. And there's that joke, isn't there, about when you're in the car and you're following the sat nav and you can't think, so you turn the radio down. It's like something sensory like that the radio is too loud, and I need to think more carefully because the sat nav's trying to take me the wrong way. I've got to override my automatic thing here. I've got to do some executive functioning, but I turn the radio down because that sensory overload it prevents me from being able to do that comfortably.
And I think overload is probably one of the key terms to have in mind if we're answering the question, what leads to executive functioning difficulties, if we use that way of looking at it, in autistic people and often people with ADHD as well. It's that, it's not that the internal systems are functioning so badly, given a proper chance and proper, learning about how their own operating system operates. I think autistic people will find, neurodivergent people will find their ways of functioning. But the thing is, there's a narrow set of options as to how you're supposed to function. And number two, there's overload. I think that is a huge part of it, and sensory sensitivity and things like that is something we may talk more about another time, but it's just a lot of the time, the way the modern world is, it's too much. It's too many different things and no room to pause and gather yourself. Like what you described there, the interruption to flow, I think is a really important one. And not only that, and I'll give an example now in a moment for myself, because it just literally happened to me there today or yesterday. But also the interruption to flow can come from inside. Not just from outside, because one of the things that I think is difficult about the school system and the education system for autistic people, for instance, is that we operate very well and function very well and executively function often very well on the basis of things we're interested in. So the thing is that if we're really interested in a subject, we can learn it very well and we can produce the goods, so to speak, from the educational system point of view. But then equally, our enthusiasm about something else can interrupt the task we're supposed to be on. And then we lose the flow. I had an interesting experience there this morning. I couldn't find my wallet when I was going to work. And that is unheard of for me, because I have my routines and they're always done the same way. So when I come home from work in the evening, I put my wallet and my keys in the same place every single time, and I pick them up from there in the morning at the same point in my routine. But when I came home yesterday evening, there was a package had been delivered, and it was, something I'd ordered that I was quite excited about, So I immediately grabbed it and then went, my partner was upstairs and I went upstairs and I was, normally I would put my keys and my wallet away, but I was so excited about this that I must have put the wallet down somewhere else and then forgotten about it, because this morning my keys were in the usual place and my wallet wasn't. And it was mind blowing, because it's just literally always there. But because I interrupted my flow, through my own enthusiasm. It's beautifully autistic, you know. I had ordered something that's to do with a special interest of mine, and it had arrived. So I was so excited about that I forgot to put my wallet in the usual place. I actually just put it in the corner of the bed, and that's where it turned up this morning, you know, underneath the duvet. But yeah, like that, those kind of things, I think, are things that it's useful for neurodivergent people to learn about themselves, and for us as therapists to help them, you know, just to destigmatize, take some of the ableism out of the executive functioning difficulties and start to see it as, well, you know, just let's learn how you operate best, how you can best make use of that given the way the world works, which is of course the limitation, you know, and understand, you know, not only how you can function to achieve your goals as well as possible, but also how to understand when it goes wrong and destigmatize that. Because like mine went wrong, but I didn't have to give out to myself for it, because, you know, in a way it almost went wrong in a nice way. Do you know what I mean? I thought, well, that's fine. That's not a problem. I was so excited I forgot to my wallet there. Well, I'm not going to criticize myself for that. Isn't it nice? You know, slight panic until I found it, but I found it anyway. Or actually, she found it, but anyway, give her credit. So yeah, it's a very real area. I think the kind of, you know, learning about this when you discover that you're autistic or have ADHD, learning what does this term mean, and what's the relevance to me, and how do I make that useful for me in some way.
And it does make you wonder whether routines have been adapted or adopted by autistic people, not because they're rigid and inflexible, but actually because it's actually very helpful, because you don't have to constantly think about where to put your wallet and then where to find it the next day. If you have a routine, you just don't have to think about that anymore. And because life is full of distractions and inconsistencies, you know, then you don't have to worry that your flow would get interrupted about when you walk in the door and thinking, right, I'm going to put the wallet here today. But if something interrupts me, I might have to deal with that as well. And then I might forget where I put the wallet, or I might not remember the next day. If you have a routine, that can really help.
Absolutely. And so I think, part of the value we can offer as therapists is helping to understand strengths and weaknesses, if you want to use that terminology. But again, I would say, when I say weaknesses, I mean largely in relation to the expectations of how the world is supposed to work nowadays, and some of those are slightly questionable. Like some of the strange long-term tasks that people have nowadays, and long-term goals are things like, trying to get good results in an A levels or leaving certificate, as we have in Ireland. I mean, that is very few people are well designed for that. That's the reality. It's not a very natural process that you spend a couple of years trying to learn to provide sufficient information in written form over the space of a few hours on a whole variety of subjects, most of which you'll never use again. Now, again, I'm not saying I've got necessarily a better system, but like the fact that anyone would struggle with that shouldn't be surprising, and shouldn't be, again, overly stigmatized. It just shows how, deeply ingrained that ableism is, that it would be so stigmatized in autistic people who, given a different system, can, as we know, be incredibly productive and incredibly creative and incredibly tenacious and incredibly accurate and all sorts of wonderful things. So yeah, helping people understand that and learn their own version of it, I think is what we can do.
Yeah, definitely. Because I mean, as you say, if you can sometimes lose your way, can't you, on long projects as well? And you can sort of just say to yourself, oh, what am I doing? Why am I not applying myself? Why am I not doing the things? Why do I just sort of feel like I don't know what I'm doing or why, or I can't get myself going? And it can sometimes be about, well, maybe I've not managed to keep the intensity of the focus to what this is all about. That's perfectly normal, just to lose track of that, and then just think, actually, what am I doing this for? What is it I'm meant to be doing? What am I aiming for? And then just go, oh yes, I remember now, I'm doing it like this because I want to achieve that, right, what are the components of me getting all that together again then, so that I get to that end point, that anticipated goal?
Well, I think that's very interesting way of putting it, because I think that in a way, when people are, in psychological contexts or helping contexts or educational contexts or therapy contexts, when problems with executive functioning are being analyzed, I often think what's missed is motivation. Like people ask questions like, well, why didn't somebody achieve that task in time? Or why do they or the person even asking themselves, why do I keep getting distracted from this? But like how much does it mean to you? Like, how motivated are you? And what is the motivation? And like, the answer could be, well, it's a subject I'm studying for to pass an exam and I'm not that interested in it. Well, the motivation might come from, but you do want to get the degree because you really want to work in that field. Yeah. So at least we can harness some motivation that is yours. This isn't just someone else's, But like, I think a lot of the time what's lost track of in the picture, but also for individuals, and certainly be some of the work I would do, would be, well, like, let's just drop some of those executive functional terminologies and just get back to motivation, in the end of it all. Yes, there's skills here that we might need to look at, but motivation counts for an awful lot, So I think, I'm very interested in sort of that motivational thinking and motivation interviewing and so on in relation to some of these issues, because a lot of motivation, proper connection with your motivation can carry you through a lot of things. And sometimes then some of these skills matter a bit less. It's like, if you're really interested in something, then you will remember a lot more about it. If you're really interested in something, you'll be able to get started on it. If you're really interested in something, you'll be able to get through some of the, challenges that come when you have to, make shifts or organize yourself, to carry through for the long term. Sometimes I find just getting people back to their own motivation. I think the area of motivation is very neglected in the whole area of neurodivergence. I mean, not so much nowadays, but in all the older model, it's like, what do people want, and what on earth would make them even make the effort that's involved in all these complex tasks, We're assuming, for instance, that the mother you described earlier is motivated to pick up her kids from school. Do you know what I mean? If she's not, well, then that's a whole other question, But at the end of it all, that's partly why, if she does remember, she'll remember, and why she will drive through difficult traffic and so on and do those complex tasks, because she just really wants to.
Yeah.
And then sometimes maybe she doesn't.
Well, yeah.
Maybe that explains why she forgets on the day, because she partly doesn't. Motivation is a big old issue. I think we might come back to it sometime. Yeah.
It is fascinating, isn't it? Because sometimes the forgetting can be a Freudian slip in a way.
It can tell you something about your connection with whatever it is we're talking about, whatever task we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. And it can be a little message to yourself from yourself somehow, that maybe you ought to look at how motivated you are or whatever, re-look at that thing. Because I think the thing as well about autistic people is that they sometimes carry on. We may be getting into something and we don't always stop and think, actually, does this still suit me? Am I still interested? Do I still want to do this? It's something that, because we often do things like maybe on the macro scale by rote, it gets started, and so we carry on and we keep going to the end.
Yeah.
And it's okay to stop and say, actually, that's all right, because it has its benefits to be like that lots of times. But also the downside of having that as a superior functioning is that sometimes you can get caught up in it without stopping to think and rethinking and think, actually, I'm not just going to carry on. Let me just think, do I want to? And why might I? Where's the motivation? What's the motivation?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And re-evaluating that as you go along was the point that you were making earlier that brought me into that territory. Yeah. And I think that's to me, that's often a big part of the work I end up doing with clients. I mean, I do look at specific skills of, emotional self-regulation, like we were looking at 2 weeks ago, and things like that. But a lot of the time I'm saying, well, let's look at motivation first, at least, to see what this
to make sure that it's in the client's interest and what the client wants. And of course, there are times that then you find it is, that person does want to actually achieve the task and is getting quite distressed and upset, actually, that they're feeling that they can't. Sometimes there can be anxiety, can't there, facing a task that's actually so huge and overwhelming, or worrying that they're going to start to engage with the task and there are going to be lots of distressing experiences from past events, that the anticipatory anxiety can be incapacitating. And it's probably about breaking it down as much as possible and literally only putting one foot in front of the other, waiting until the arousal level is reduced before going and putting the next foot in front.
Yeah, well, procrastination is probably the most common executive functioning problem in the whole world amongst human beings in general. And mostly it's some mixture of high anxiety and low motivation. So, things that need addressing, maybe it's a topic we'll talk about sometime. But I suppose time-wise, we're coming to the end for today. But, like I mentioned ADHD there a few times as well. And like executive functioning, like if the term executive dysfunction comes up a good bit around, talking about autistic people, it comes up even more, I think, talking about people with ADHD. So might be good just to devote a session to that.
Absolutely, because there's a lot of crossover, but in fact, it's a big feature for ADHDers. Certainly, something that I hear every day that they talk about in their sessions.
So we might just talk about ADHD next time, and maybe a bit of the similarities and differences with autism, but then maybe just go into the executive functioning aspects of ADHD along with whatever else comes up. Yeah.
I read something really interesting, just as a very quick teaser to end on. In one of the papers that I was reading, it said that the autism executive dysfunctioning is about cold executive functioning and ADHD is hot executive functioning. Now, don't ask me any more than that because I don't know, but I'm intrigued to find out.
Oh, yeah, dude. Wow, that's interesting because I haven't come across that. That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So it never goes the way you think, does it?
I never quite goes the way you think, but then that's part of the interest of it. I wouldn't like it to be over-structured, and
I tell you what I did
too much.
What I did read was interesting that sparked off my thoughts as well. That there's something about fluidity, right? With executive functioning, about cognitive fluidity, and we're talking about motor as well, and speech. Right. And I thought, that's interesting because fluidity, I know that certainly that's one of, and I thought, I've got a light bulb moment here for my own speech. I've never been great at using language anyway, and being able to order my thoughts to put one word in front of the other. I thought it was only that, but there's something about making long strings of propositions it involves executive functioning and actually fluidity and set shifting. And I thought that's very interesting that it's related to speech. And with autistic people, there's a lot of issues around using language.
Yeah, that's interesting.
For all of us, I think, not just for people who are.
No. I mean, it's
or very adept at using language.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah,
lexical, aren't they?
But yes, but not in a normal way.
Why'd you say that?
Well, a lot of autistic people who are hyperlexical, the way they talk actually sounds strange to a lot of people, particularly when you're younger. You sort of get away with it a bit more the further you get into adulthood. But a lot of younger autistic people, for instance, the way they talk is seen as very kind of bookish, or using big words and long sentences, and not talking in a natural, normal way. So they can be very fluent and very articulate, but not in a way that comes across as acceptable. So that is interesting. That is very interesting. And like a thing that I've seen in autistic people and people with ADHD and people with both, and we've talked about this with a few clients, is like that normal speech is supposed to be linear. In other words, you follow a track. And even when you write, you're supposed to, whereas the way a lot of autistic and ADHD people think is in footnotes and parentheses and tangents. So it's, in other words, they're kind of saying, so, but also, of course, don't forget, but then coming back to this, and by the way, don't forget that, and,
Yes.
so it's not just like finished. It's like and that, and don't forget this, and then I'll come back to this another time, and and
That's
that
it.
again, most people
Yeah.
just can't process that. So it's seen as off track and unhelpful and tangenty and so on. And a couple of my clients and one of my supervisees keeps criticizing themselves for tangenting, and I'm saying, what's the problem? So it's very interesting. Yeah, sure, that's where your mind goes, go there, and we'll come back to this again. It's like they've learned to see it as a bad thing.
Yeah.
But what the reality, of course, is it's just different. It's different. That's all. It is just simply different. And in some ways, actually, can be really creative and just lose people because it's too creative. But it's certainly just different. So there is something different. I think that's very interesting about the whole notion of flow. When it comes to neurodivergent language, it doesn't flow the way it flows near the neurotypical world.
I have an autistic friend actually, and she speaks beautifully. And you know what? Some of the words that she uses, I get why she loves them, because I can feel the sensory feeling of that particular word. And I personally am not fascinated by words, but my friend is, and takes
I
great.
am as well. Yeah.
And I get it though, taking great delight in discovering new words and remembering them and being able to use them. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Great.
Great. You take care, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks. Yeah. Righto. Bye.